Hello, we're back and we're covering transcendental idealism by way of Immanuel Kant. We're looking at a reading from an old textbook of mine, Philosophy, a Text with Readings by Manuel Velasquez. And I have you focus on a chapter, Kant, Does the Knowing Mind Shape the World? So what is transcendental idealism? Emmanuel Velasquez characterizes it as Kant's new view is now called transcendental idealism. It holds that the world that appears to be around us is a world that our mind constructs. Our mind arranges the sensations that come from its senses into orderly structures or patterns. So let's keep in mind there that transcendental idealism means a couple things. One is it shows us the connection that Kant was making between empiricism and rational thought as well. So in other words, empiricism characterized by David Hume and rational thought characterized by people like Descartes come together in Kant's transcendental idealism. Okay, so that's one way to understand what transcendental idealism is very clearly. Okay. Another way to understand it too is see it as an abstraction. In other words, transcendental means to go beyond. So to go beyond is to go beyond experience in order to understand what it is in the way that our mind structures that experience. So idealism is a way that we understand something by way of mind, okay? Whereas transcendental means to go beyond. And so we're using perception in order to go beyond by way of the structuring mechanism of reason, okay? So in other words, the way our mind works has what I call the software of rational capacity. So in other words, our rational capacity that we are born with innately enables us to structure the world of empirical perception, okay? So in other words, transcendental idealism, as I indicated, is a way that rational understanding and empirical understanding come together to be one philosophy, one epistemology, okay? So one way in which we're understanding the way we know about something, okay? So we're understanding knowledge. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. So therefore, this is getting us to a better understanding of how it is that we understand something for Kant. Okay? Hoping that wind's not going to be too loud. So yes. So we start though. So and Kant started by way of Hume. So in other words, with Hume, he calls into question, as we looked at already, he's calling into question a basic way in which we're understanding causation. That in other words, the problem of causation for Hume was that we bring in a connection, a necessary connection that is not evident in experience. Well, that necessary connection is something that we typically characterize as reason, okay? And that is one event causes another, right? So in other words, that one event causes another is a rational connection that Hume thought was just habit. So remember, he was skeptical of the rational connection that the rationalists make, whereas Kant thought of this and he thought to himself, well, wait a minute, maybe the issue is that, yes, you're right, Hume, there is not the rational connection to be found in an empirical way of understanding that where the necessary connection is to be found in empiricism. You're right there. So maybe what we're thinking of is that our mind supplies that connection, and our mind supplies that by way of rational understanding. In other words, our rational way of understanding organizes the information that is brought to us by way of the senses in order to be a full experience that we call knowledge. So in other words, the way that we know things is understood perceptually, and the way that perception is then organized is by way of rational thought. In other words, rational thought has us organizing the perceptual experiences that we have empirically. Okay? So, in other words, Hume woke Kant out of his dogmatic slumbers in order to recognize this. Okay? And so that's key to knowing how it is that transcendental idealism is understood, and likewise the connection to Hume and also to Descartes, interestingly enough, as well. And so we have several terms here. I have it drawn out on this little piece of note paper. So we have two ways that we understand the world. One is by way of an a priori understanding. That is what we typically call reason. Okay, so that's pure reason. A priori is the way that we understand things prior to experience. That's pure reason. Velasquez characterizes that as what must be true of any number of some group and known prior to experience. So that's otherwise known as reason. Okay, and then we also have a posteriori understanding, which is after experience. Okay, and so that might be thought of as something like empiricism. Okay, and then we also have another way of understanding that's analytic, by way of an analytic statement. So an analytic statement is also a corollary to reason. So something like a triangle has three sides is an analytic statement, okay, whereby we don't need to go to experience in order to know that a triangle has three sides. It's true by definition, okay? So in other words, it's a rational way that we understand something analytically, okay? And then a synthetic statement is that this way in which we have to go out into the world in order to understand that every event has a cause. So every event has a cause is something that we have to go out into the world to understand how that actually works. And so we have the famous connection that Kant made, which is otherwise known as transcendental idealism. So another way of understanding what transcendental idealism is by way of what Kant calls a synthetic a priori understanding. So a synthetic a priori statement is a way that we understand something by way of experience. In other words, we have to go out into the world in order to understand that every event has a cause, but we also make the connection rationally apart from experience, okay? So we make the a priori connection that every event must have a cause by way of reason. So in other words, reason and empiricism are linked by way of transcendental idealism, and they are also linked by way of what Kant calls a synthetic a priori statement, okay? And that's a way that we understand the world by way of transcendental idealism, right? And so a couple things that are interesting about that is that transcendental idealism is showing that we need to go beyond the world in order to understand the world experientially, right? We go beyond the world in order to understand it by way of reason, okay? And one way that we do that that's rather important is by way of understanding how time and space works. So in other words, space is something that we understand as a precondition for knowledge. In other words, when we imagine space, we could imagine space without objects in it, yet we cannot imagine a world of objects without any space. And so because of that way of understanding space, Kant says that then space is a priori. In other words, it's something that is prior to experience as a way that we understand the world in general. In other words, we can't have an understanding of the world without the way that we understand space. So in other words, we can't even have concepts before we have space, okay? So in other words, we also do the same thing with the way that we understand time as well. So time must be present in our minds before we can perceive of objects existing in time. And so we usually don't consider objects outside of time, okay? And so that shows us that both time and space are not only a priori, but they're preconditions of thinking, okay? And so they're preconditions of thinking, and likewise, they're the way that we understand mathematics and geometry, right? So we understand geometry and arithmetic. So geometric understanding is a spatial understanding that's presupposed before we even go out to experience. And likewise, time is the same way. So both time and space are a priori. Those are preconditions of the way that we know the world, okay? So that's a great way to start getting us to understanding some of the importance of Kant, as far as Kant and transcendental idealism being a perfect blend of the empirical way in which we understand the world and the rational way in which we understand the world. So I hope that helps, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks, class.